In the shadowed chapels of medieval Europe, justice wasn't always blind, but it could be choking. When courts lacked evidence and witnesses were scarce, divine judgment stepped in. The accused would stand before an altar, handed a piece of dry bread and aged cheese. No water, no mercy. If they swallowed cleanly, they were innocent. But if they gagged, coughed, or choked, it was proof of guilt, a sign that God himself had intervened. This wasn't a metaphor. It was the law, a trial by digestion, where salvation or condemnation hinged on a single bite. But how did such a ritual come to exist? And what does it reveal about fear, faith, and the fragile line between justice and superstition? In the annals of medieval Europe, justice was never only a matter of evidence, testimony, and sober deliberation. Rather, it was an arena where faith and fear intertwined, where the sacred and the mundane blurred until even the most ordinary objects became instruments of divine judgment. Among the strangest practices born of this fusion was the ordeal of cheese and bread, judicium panis et kci, a ritual trial in which guilt or innocence was determined not by persuasion or proof, but by the swallowing of a simple meal before God's altar. If the accused ate without difficulty, they were declared innocent. If they choked, coughed, or failed to swallow, divine will had revealed their guilt. This practice emerged in a world where human judgment was mistrusted, not least because corruption, favoritism, and ignorance haunted every courtroom. The medieval mind believed that only God could truly discern the hidden truths of the heart, and thus ordeals, ritualized tests involving water, fire, iron, or food, became a bridge between divine justice and human affairs. Where a king's court faltered, heaven itself would pronounce the verdict. The ordeal of bread and cheese was both less violent than plunging one's arm into boiling water and more intimate than trial by combat, yet it carried the same weight of sacred certainty. The origins of this strange ordeal are clouded by time. Scholars trace it to early medieval canon law, where church councils codified rituals meant to resolve disputes too murky for human evidence. Some suggest it may even have roots in Germanic or Celtic sacramental traditions, where food was bound with oath and curse. Whatever its beginnings, by the 9th and 10th centuries, the practice had spread across regions of Western Europe, particularly among the Frankish and Anglo-Saxon realms. Its very strangeness lent it authority. To choke in church, at the foot of the altar, was not merely a physical accident, but a divine intervention. The ritual was stark in its simplicity, yet thick with symbolism. The accused was led to a church, where before the altar of God a piece of consecrated bread and cheese awaited, sometimes blessed by a priest, sometimes accompanied by prayers invoking the judgment of heaven. In certain regions, the food was inscribed with the words of the gospel or placed upon holy relics. The accused swore an oath of innocence, then consumed the offering. The congregation or assembled community watched closely, breaths held. For the outcome rested not in argument or testimony, but in the mysterious mechanics of the throat. If the accused swallowed smoothly, God had permitted their vindication. If they gagged, stumbled, or could not consume, guilt was declared. In some versions, a failure meant not merely guilt but immediate punishment, from fines and confiscation to exile and even execution. It is tempting to laugh at such a ritual today, imagining how nerves alone might seal the fate of an innocent. Yet for the medieval world, it was deadly serious. In an age of poor literacy and limited forensic skill, the ordeal offered a clear and shared resolution to disputes. Everyone present could witness the act. Everyone could agree that the divine had spoken, and therein lay its power. The ordeal did not just test the accused. It reaffirmed the community's trust in God's active presence in earthly justice. The ordeal of bread and cheese was most often used in cases where human testimony failed, petty theft, disputed oaths, or crimes hidden from direct evidence. Yet records also indicate it was sometimes employed in graver charges, even accusations of sacrilege or treason. The ordeal thus became a weapon not just of justice but of fear, a ritual through which the church and crown reminded the populace that nothing, no crime, no deceit, escaped divine notice. But beneath the ritual lay troubling ironies. The very foods chosen, bread and cheese, were among the most fundamental of medieval sustenance, the daily fare of peasants and nobles alike. Bread was already sacred through its association with the Eucharist, the body of Christ consumed in Massachusetts cheese, though humbler, symbolized nourishment, community, and survival. To transform these staples into instruments of judgment was to make the act of eating itself a sacred trial. Where one expected life, one could find condemnation. Some medieval writers recorded with awe the results of such ordeals. They spoke of liars choking as if gripped by unseen hands, of guilty men gasping and convulsing in front of horrified witnesses. To them, these were not coincidences, but miracles, confirmations of the divine hand in justice. Yet not all contemporaries were convinced. Skeptics whispered that nerves could betray the innocent, that priests or accusers might tamper with the ritual. Indeed, as church reform gained momentum in the 12th century, many clerics began to question the ordeal's legitimacy, branding it superstition rather than sacrament. Eventually, by the Lateran Council of 1215, the Church formally forbade clergy from participating in ordeals, severing the tie between ritual and divine authority. Without ecclesiastical sanction, the ordeal of bread and cheese withered, remembered more as a curiosity than a central institution of law. Still, the practice left an imprint. Its echoes can be traced in folklore and literature, in superstitions about food and oaths, even in later European practices of ordeal by morsel, where swallowing remained a test of truth. And in its strange mingling of the sacred and the bodily, it reveals something profound about the medieval world: the deep hunger for certainty, the desperate trust in divine intervention, and the willingness to bind even the simplest acts of life, eating, drinking, swallowing, into the fabric of justice. To the modern mind, the ordeal by cheese and bread may appear barbaric, absurd, even comical. Yet it was neither to those who lived beneath its shadow. For them, it was deadly serious, a moment where breath and life hung on whether God permitted the throat to clear. One could not swallow guilt. One could only choke upon it. Thus begins the tale of one of history's strangest trials, where the verdict of heaven was hidden not in fire or iron, but in a mouthful of bread and cheese, consumed beneath the gaze of the altar, priest, and community. A ritual now forgotten, yet once powerful enough to decide the fates of men and women, guilty or innocent by the most fragile of measures, a swallow. To understand how a ritual as peculiar as the ordeal of cheese and bread could take hold in medieval Europe, one must first descend into the broader world of ordeal justice. Long before a frightened villager found themselves chewing bread beneath the vaulted shadows of a church altar, earlier civilizations had already turned to trials of fire, water, or poison as instruments of divine judgment. The ordeal was not born in a vacuum. It was the inheritor of a deep human instinct. When truth lay hidden and proof impossible, the gods, or God, must be called to decide. Ancient Mesopotamia offers some of the earliest glimpses into ordeal tradition. The Code of Hammurabi, carved into basalt in the 18th century BCE, contains prescriptions for trial by water. If a man was accused of sorcery or theft and evidence could not prove the case, he was cast into the river. Should he sink and drown, guilt was confirmed. Should he float or escape, the gods had shown his innocence. Here the river was not just water but a divine force, a living witness whose embrace could exonerate or condemn. The message was stark. The truth was too sacred to be left to fallible men. From the Near East, the idea of divine ordeal radiated outward. In ancient India, trials by fire, boiling oil, or sacred oaths bound litigants to outcomes enforced by supernatural powers. In West African traditions, poisonous beans or potions became the medium of divine proof, a practice still lingering in some regions centuries later. The ordeal was thus nearly universal, a human impulse found wherever fear of hidden guilt clashed with the need for judgment. In Europe, the Germanic tribes who pressed against Rome's frontiers carried their own versions of ordeal justice. Among the Saxons, Salian Franks, and Lombards, the accused might be forced to grasp red-hot iron, plunge a hand into boiling water, or walk blindfolded across burning plowshares. Surviving unscathed was taken as evidence of divine favor. These customs persisted into the early Middle Ages, and when Christianization swept across these peoples, they did not vanish. Instead, they were absorbed and reshaped. The Christian God replaced pagan deities, but the logic remained. Truth could be revealed through suffering and survival. It is in this context that the ordeal of food, the bread and cheese trial, began to emerge. Compared to fire and boiling water, it seems almost gentle, yet its symbolism was no less powerful. Food was sacred in Christian ritual, bread as the body of Christ, shared at every Mass, wine as his blood. To swear innocence and then prove it by swallowing bread was to merge one's body with the act of oath-taking, to invite God directly into the mouth and throat as witness. Where pagan ordeals had relied on the elements, fire, water, earth, this ordeal relied on sustenance itself, the sacred daily gift of God that sustained human life. By the 9th and 10th centuries, church councils and canon law began codifying ordeals. Charlemagne's empire, sprawling and fragmented, leaned on ordeal justice to settle disputes where evidence was weak and local loyalties could cloud human judgment. Priests often presided over the rituals, blessing the instruments or foods involved. The Church did not invent ordeals, but it sanctified them, embedding them into Christian ritual space. This sanctification gave ordeals legitimacy. To eat bread and cheese before the altar was not merely to prove innocence. It was to place one's fate openly into the hands of the divine. Yet the ordeal by food carried peculiar associations that made it distinct. Unlike fire and water, which tested endurance against external forces, this ordeal turned inward. It was the body itself that betrayed or confirmed innocence. The act of swallowing was precarious, delicate, easily disturbed by nerves, fear, or the dryness of the mouth. For the medieval mind, this frailty was precisely what allowed divine will to manifest. If guilt weighed upon the soul, God would constrict the throat. If innocence reigned, the mouth would open and the body would obey. Surviving records show that the ordeal of bread and cheese was often linked to oath-taking. It was a means of confirming truth where swearing alone seemed insufficient. In one version, the accused swore an oath over the bread and cheese before consuming it. The oath bound the act. God himself was watching, and to choke was to prove that the oath was false. This dual structure, oath and ordeal combined, gave the ritual double weight. Not only did the accused risk divine punishment for perjury, they risked public disgrace and legal condemnation if their body failed to obey. The ordeal of cheese and bread also reveals the medieval fear of hidden crimes. Theft in particular haunted small agrarian communities. In villages where possessions were few and survival precarious, the theft of grain, tools, or livestock could devastate a family. Yet evidence was scarce, witnesses unreliable, and accusations bitter. The ordeal provided a way forward. Gather the community, call the priest, lay bread and cheese upon the altar. Let the accused eat, and let God speak through the swallow. In this way, justice was rendered not by a lord or jury, but by heaven itself, mediated through the simplest and most universal of human actions. Historians debate how widespread the ordeal by food truly was. Surviving records are patchy, scattered across continental Europe and Anglo-Saxon England. Some suggest it was never as common as ordeals by fire or water, but it had symbolic appeal because of its ties to the Eucharist. Others argue it was primarily reserved for clerics or lower-stakes disputes, as it carried less risk of mutilation or death than the fiery alternatives. Whatever the truth, its presence in law codes and chronicles proves it was more than legend. Real men and women once stood before altars, hands trembling, mouths dry, and placed their fate on a single swallow. The ordeal tradition in general thrived because it offered certainty where none existed. Medieval Europe was a world of superstition, but it was also a world hungry for order. Ordeals resolved disputes quickly and decisively, leaving little room for continued quarrel. Whether the accused lived or died, swallowed or choked, the matter was settled. Communities could move on. That was perhaps their greatest function, not the discovery of truth, but the restoration of peace through ritualized closure. By the 12th century, the Church itself began to sour on ordeals. Reformers criticized them as relics of paganism, superstitious rather than sacramental. Learned canonists argued that God should not be put to the test. and that human justice must find firmer ground. The Lateran Council of 1215's ban on clerical involvement dealt ordeals a mortal blow. Without priests to sanctify them, ordeals lost their legitimacy. Gradually they vanished, replaced by trial by jury and evolving legal processes. But the memory of the ordeal of bread and cheese lingered in chronicles, a reminder of a time when the throat itself was a courtroom and a crust of bread the instrument of truth. The ordeal of food illustrates, in miniature, the great medieval struggle between faith and reason, ritual and evidence, divine judgment and human law. It grew from ancient instincts, thrived in a world where God's will was thought immediate and tangible, and faded as rational systems of justice took hold. Yet, even in its disappearance, it remains telling. For what could be more human, more fragile, more laden with symbolism, than trusting the act of eating to reveal innocence or guilt? The roots of ordeal justice are as old as civilization itself, but in the bread and cheese of the medieval altar, we glimpse the uniquely Christianized form it took, a test at once intimate and sacred, absurd and terrifying, a ritual that reveals as much about the human hunger for certainty as it does about the divine. The ordeal of cheese and bread was not a casual act, but a carefully choreographed ritual. To medieval eyes, its power lay not only in the act of eating, but in the solemn stage upon which it was performed. Every movement, every word, every gesture carried symbolic weight, drawing upon centuries of Christian liturgy, communal expectation, and the ever-present fear of divine wrath. To understand its force, one must reconstruct the trial step by step, as though standing in the dim nave of a 12th-century parish church, the air heavy with incense, the villagers hushed in anticipation. The first stage began outside the church walls, in the sphere of accusation. A crime had been committed, perhaps a theft of grain, a quarrel that escalated into claims of sorcery, or suspicion of oath-breaking. Evidence was scarce, witnesses uncertain, and so the community turned to the ordeal. It was not the first resort but the last, invoked when human means of judgment had failed. The accused, already stigmatized by suspicion, was summoned to appear. That summons itself carried weight. It was a public proclamation that the matter was grave enough to demand God's judgment. Upon entering the church, the accused did not walk alone. The priest, vested in liturgical garments, stood at the altar as mediator between the mortal and divine. Clerks or deacons assisted, bearing relics, censers, and holy water. The community gathered as witnesses, neighbors, kin, accusers, and lords, crowding the nave with anxious silence. For the ordeal was not a private test, but a public spectacle, its efficacy dependent on the communal act of witnessing God's intervention. The bread and cheese were laid upon the altar, often directly upon a linen cloth reserved for sacred use. In some accounts, the bread was blessed with the same solemnity as the Eucharist, though it was not consecrated in the strict sense. To confuse the ordeal with communion would have bordered on sacrilege. Instead, it was a parallel act, sacred food, but not the sacrament itself. The cheese, too, bore weight. Cheese in medieval Europe was more than sustenance. It was preserved milk, the transmuted gift of livestock, central to survival in lean months. To combine bread and cheese was to combine field and herd, grain and pasture, the foundations of agrarian life. The priest then invoked divine presence. Prayers were spoken aloud, often psalms that called upon God as judge and protector. Some texts survive with chilling specificity, invocations that God might strike the guilty with choking, that the throat of the liar might close as tightly as Pharaoh's heart. The bread and cheese were sanctified not as blessing but as trap, for the innocent, nourishment, for the guilty, poison. At this moment, the objects on the altar ceased to be mere food. They had become instruments of divine judgment. The accused was required to swear an oath before approaching the food. The oath was binding in both temporal and eternal senses. To swear falsely before God was to court damnation. The words varied but typically invoked Christ, saints, and holy relics. The accused might place a hand upon a gospel book or relic while swearing, reinforcing the gravity of the act. This oath was more than a prelude. It was the opening plea in the divine courtroom, an appeal to heaven that one's words were true. At last came the central moment, the eating. The accused took the bread and cheese in hand, blessed or cursed by the murmuring crowd, and raised it to their mouth. The church grew still, every eye fixed on the act of chewing. The accused body became the site of drama, the mouth and throat the battleground between guilt and innocence. A dry mouth could betray them. A trembling hand could scatter crumbs. A constricted throat could halt the swallow. For the villagers watching, every cough, every hesitation was heavy with meaning. If the accused swallowed smoothly, they were declared innocent. The priest might proclaim God's mercy, and the crowd would disperse with relief, the matter settled. If the accused choked, coughed, or failed to swallow, guilt was pronounced. The punishment that followed depended on local law: fines, mutilation, banishment, even death for severe crimes. In some cases, choking itself might be fatal, a grim confirmation of guilt in the eyes of the community. But the ritual did not end with the swallow. Priests often followed the act with prayers of thanksgiving or judgment, binding the outcome to divine will. In many places, records of the ordeal were kept, either in ecclesiastical notes or in chronicles, ensuring the verdict could be remembered and appealed to later. The ordeal was thus not an isolated act, but part of a continuum of law and memory, woven into the broader system of medieval justice. The psychological dimensions of the ordeal cannot be ignored. To modern observers, it may seem that nervousness, dry throat, or fear of public shame could easily cause choking, regardless of guilt. Yet this fragility was precisely its strength. The ordeal was meant to terrify. It was designed to magnify the weight of the accusation, to force the accused into a state where only true innocence, and the calm assurance it supposedly brought, could secure survival. In this sense, the ordeal was as much about performance as outcome. The innocent who believed in their innocence might approach with steadier nerves. The guilty, haunted by conscience, might falter. The ordeal's staging also emphasized hierarchy. The priest presided, but the community enforced. Lords might order the ordeal, but villagers gathered to witness and affirm the outcome. This made the ordeal both top-down and bottom-up. It was a ritual where divine justice intersected with communal consent. Everyone played a role. The priest as mediator, the accused as subject, the crowd as judges of the body's visible signs. At times, ordeals were manipulated. Priests sympathetic to the accused might moisten the bread to ease swallowing. Unsympathetic priests might allow it to grow dry and stale, ensuring difficulty. Such interventions reveal the human hand behind divine judgment, yet the ritual's power remained. For even manipulated, it was accepted by the community as God's will, demonstrating how flexible and pragmatic medieval justice could be beneath its veneer of the sacred. The ordeal of cheese and bread was not merely a legal test, but a liturgical drama. It fused law and liturgy, justice and sacrament, fear and faith. It enacted in miniature the entire medieval worldview, that God was immanent, present in every act, ready to reveal truth through signs and wonders. In this way, the ritual unfolded not as absurdity but as solemn necessity, a performance that bound communities together in their shared submission to divine judgment. It is tempting to laugh at such a spectacle today, but to medieval villagers, it was deadly serious. For them, God's hand was not abstract but immediate, a force that could tighten a throat as surely as part the Red Sea. In the chew of bread, in the swallow of cheese, eternal justice was revealed. And whether the accused walked free or was condemned, the community left the church convinced that truth had been spoken, not by man, but by heaven itself. To grasp the ordeal of cheese and bread not merely as ritual, but as lived reality, one must turn to the chronicles, miracle books, and local records that preserve fragments of individual cases. Though scattered, they reveal how flesh and blood men and women stood before their neighbors and before God, their fates bound to a mouthful of bread and cheese. Each story illuminates the tension between faith and fear, justice and chance, and the human drama at the heart of the ordeal. One of the earliest surviving references comes from an English collection of miracles in the 11th century. A monk recorded that a man accused of perjury stood before the altar with bread and cheese sanctified for the ordeal. He swore solemnly that he spoke truth, yet when he lifted the bread to his lips, his throat convulsed, and he could not swallow. He fell to the ground, choking violently, as the assembled crowd cried out that God had revealed his guilt. The miracle writer seized upon the episode as proof of divine justice in action, a warning to others who might perjure themselves. To the chronicler, this was not chance but demonstration, the invisible God made visible through a gag and a spasm. Another tale, preserved in a German manuscript from the 12th century, tells of a woman accused of theft. She maintained her innocence with fierce conviction, protesting that she had not taken the missing wool. The priest prepared the ordeal, praying that God would reveal truth. Before the altar, she swallowed the bread and cheese without faltering. The crowd, struck by her composure, rejoiced at her vindication. Later, the true thief confessed, tormented by guilt and perhaps by the fear that God would strike him down in turn. Here the ordeal functioned not only as test, but as absolution. It lifted suspicion from an innocent woman and redirected shame upon the guilty. Some accounts reveal the ordeal's fragility. A 13th-century chronicler in France recorded the case of a man who prepared to undergo the bread and cheese test when a sympathetic priest moistened the bread with wine, easing its passage. The accused swallowed smoothly and was acquitted. Whispers later suggested the priest's intervention had spared him, but no one dared challenge the verdict, for to do so would undermine the ordeal itself. Thus, even when manipulated, the ritual's authority held. The community needed certainty, and the appearance of divine judgment was enough to secure it. Perhaps the most chilling stories involve those who choked not briefly, but fatally. A chronicle from Flanders recounts a suspected murderer brought to trial by ordeal. Before a throng of villagers, he placed the food in his mouth, bit down, and attempted to swallow. But his throat seized, his face turned purple, and he collapsed. Despite efforts to revive him, he died on the church floor, gasping for air. To the chronicler, this was not tragedy but triumph. God's justice executed directly, saving the community from the burden of punishment. The congregation reportedly departed in awe, convinced they had witnessed a miracle of judgment. Beyond chronicles, legal records occasionally reference the ordeal as part of formal proceedings. In England under the Normans, documents of manorial courts show accused tenants compelled to undergo the test when disputes over land or oaths could not be resolved. These references are sparse and formulaic, but they reveal how embedded the ordeal was in local justice. It was not exotic spectacle, but part of the legal fabric, invoked when the balance of power and evidence was uncertain. Hagiographical texts, lives of saints, also depict the ordeal, though with embellishment. One saint's vita describes how a holy man interceded when an innocent was wrongly accused. The accused, about to undergo the ordeal, prayed to the saint, who miraculously softened the bread and cheese, allowing a smooth swallow. The miracle confirmed both the accused's innocence and the saint's power. In such narratives, the ordeal became canvas for sanctity. God judged, but saints mediated. What emerges from these cases is not uniformity, but diversity. Some accused faltered, some triumphed, some died, some survived. Yet all were woven into a narrative of divine judgment. Communities sought in these outcomes confirmation of their deepest conviction, that truth was not hidden, that God could not be mocked, that justice was possible in a world where evidence was scarce. Modern readers might suspect nervousness or stagecraft. A dry mouth, trembling hands, or the priest's subtle manipulations could easily determine outcome. Indeed, some historians argue that the ordeal was less about divine intervention than about communal psychology. The guilty, racked by fear, were more likely to choke. The innocent, steadied by conviction, more likely to succeed. Priests and lords may have guided outcomes toward the socially convenient verdict, ensuring that justice aligned with communal needs. In this reading, the ordeal was theater, yet theater with deadly stakes. Still, to dismiss it as pure performance would miss its medieval meaning. To those who lived it, the choking throat was not coincidence, but divine speech. Every cough carried cosmic significance. Every swallow bore the weight of eternal truth. The ordeal of cheese and bread was not merely about guilt or innocence. It was about reasserting the presence of God in daily life. It reminded communities that even in the darkest disputes, heaven itself bent low to judge among them. One might imagine the psychological impact upon the accused. to stand in a crowded church before neighbors, kin, and enemies, with one's honor and life hinging on a swallow. This was no small torment. The heart must have thundered, the palms sweated, the throat dried under dozens of eyes. To succeed was to emerge reborn, cleansed of suspicion, one's reputation restored. To fail was to be ruined, branded guilty by God, abandoned by the very community to which one belonged. The ordeal was thus a crucible of identity, shaping not only legal outcomes, but social belonging. Though cases survive only in fragments, they point to a lived reality repeated countless times across centuries. Farmers, shepherds, widows, merchants, knights. Any could be summoned to the altar to chew and swallow before heaven. Each case became part of communal memory, told and retold as warning or vindication. Each was folded into the larger tapestry of medieval justice, where the sacred and the judicial were never far apart. In these cases, one sees the ordeal not as curiosity, but as heartbeat of an age where law and liturgy fused, where truth was fragile, and where God was believed to speak through the simple act of eating. The ordeal of cheese and bread, like other forms of trial by ordeal, rested on an audacious theological claim that God would intervene directly, visibly, and reliably in the affairs of men. It asked the faithful to believe that the Creator of heaven and earth concerned himself with the swallowing of bread in a provincial chapel, that the eternal judge would stoop to constrict or relax a human throat at the appointed moment. For centuries, that belief was not only accepted but celebrated. Yet it was never without its tensions. Churchmen, theologians, and jurists wrestled with its legitimacy, its dangers, and its meaning, leaving behind a trail of debates that illuminate both the confidence and the doubt within medieval Christianity. The roots of ecclesiastical support for the ordeal lay deep in Scripture. Clerics cited passages from the Old Testament where God revealed guilt or innocence through miraculous signs. The ordeal of bitter water in Numbers 5, where a woman suspected of adultery was made to drink a potion and her body's response revealed her fate. The stories of Gideon seeking signs from God with fleece, or the contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, in which divine fire from heaven judged the true prophet. These examples provided a biblical framework. God had spoken through material tests before, and he might do so still. The ordeal of cheese and bread, in particular, resonated with Christian sacramental thought. Bread and cheese, ordinary foods, became sacred when blessed upon the altar. They hovered in meaning between the Eucharist and the mundane meal, bearing the aura of holiness without being confused with the consecrated host. To eat them was to consume symbols of divine judgment, linking one's fate to the very heart of Christian ritual life. For many clerics, this imbued the ordeal with sacramental weight. The accused swore oaths and partook in sacred food, placing themselves directly in God's hands. Yet from the earliest records, unease stirred. Not all theologians welcomed the ordeal's claims. Some questioned whether it was proper to tempt God by demanding a miracle on human terms. Augustine of Hippo, centuries before the ordeal took its medieval form, had warned against presumption, against treating God as though he must answer on command. Though Augustine's caution was not directly aimed at trials by ordeal, later theologians drew upon his teaching to argue that compelling divine judgment through bread and cheese was a dangerous misuse of faith. By the 12th century, as canon law developed into a sophisticated body of jurisprudence, the ordeal became subject to sharper critique. Gratian's Decretum, the foundational text of medieval canon law, did not explicitly forbid ordeals, but it emphasized the primacy of human testimony, confession, and rational judgment. As papal authority grew stronger, voices within the Church began to question whether ordeals truly reflected God's will or whether they exposed the Church to ridicule when outcomes seemed arbitrary. Theologians debated the mechanism by which God might act in the ordeal. Did he directly constrict the throat of the guilty? Did angels intervene, unseen, to guide the swallow? Or was the ordeal simply a stage upon which guilt manifested naturally, through the guilty party's nervousness, their dry mouth, their trembling hesitation? Theologians like Peter Lombard and later scholastics flirted with such questions, not always with consensus. Some argued that God did not act in every individual case but allowed natural causes, fear, dryness of mouth, to serve as justice. Others insisted that miracles, even small ones, were part of his providential governance. The ordeal also raised questions about sacraments. Some worried that using food blessed on the altar blurred the line between sacred rite and judicial test. Was it sacrilege to turn bread and cheese, blessed in God's name, into instruments of potential death? Could this cheapen the Eucharist, the supreme sacrament of unity? Critics whispered that the ordeal risked profaning what was holy, reducing divine mysteries to a crude courtroom device. Still, defenders remained. To them, the ordeal was pastoral as well as judicial. It offered the innocent a way to clear their name when no human evidence sufficed. It provided the community with closure, preventing feuds and suspicion from festering. And it preserved peace by giving people confidence that justice was not merely human guesswork, but divine certainty. Theologically, it was not so much presumption as reliance. If God governed all, surely he governed the throat as well as the stars. The ordeal also meshed with medieval understandings of oaths and truth. To swear falsely was to imperil one's soul. By binding an oath to sacred food, the ordeal heightened the stakes. Perjury was no longer abstract, but embodied in the act of eating. If the liar choked, it was confirmation of what everyone already believed, that God abhorred falsehood. Thus, the ordeal reinforced not only law but theology, embedding the moral order into the very fibers of the community. Yet unease never fully disappeared. Bishops and councils occasionally voiced disquiet. The Council of Tribur in 895, for example, expressed doubts about ordeals, though it did not abolish them. In the 12th century, a slow shift occurred. Intellectuals trained in the new universities of Paris and Bologna began to favor rational proof over miraculous signs. The ordeal appeared increasingly as a relic of a less sophisticated age, a practice more suited to rustic piety than to the refined logic of canonists. The climax of this tension arrived in 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council convened by Pope Innocent III. The council prohibited clergy from participating in ordeals, effectively stripping them of their religious legitimacy. Without priestly blessing, the ordeal of cheese and bread withered. The decision reflected both theological caution and a larger shift toward inquisitorial procedure, confession, and rational investigation. It was a decisive moment when the Church, long complicit in ordeals, finally turned away from them. Still, for centuries before their abolition, ordeals thrived under clerical sanction. They were not fringe superstitions, but central instruments of medieval justice, justified by serious theological arguments. The very debates surrounding them show the richness of medieval thought, a world both credulous and cautious, imaginative and analytical, ready to believe in miracles yet wary of presumption. In the end, the ordeal of cheese and bread reveals a medieval church wrestling with its own role as mediator of truth. Was justice better served by awaiting God's visible hand or by cultivating rational procedures? Was faith shown by trusting in miracles or by avoiding their demand? The ordeal forced these questions into the open, and in the answers one can trace the slow transformation of Western legal and religious thought. Theology and doubt thus walked hand in hand. Even as priests blessed bread and cheese, even as villagers crowded into chapels to watch the accused chew and swallow, there were always voices asking, is this truly God's will, or merely our own desire dressed in sacred garb? To understand the ordeal of cheese and bread merely as a legal procedure is to miss its deeper social and cultural resonance. For in the medieval world, law was not only about justice in the abstract, but about the health of the community, the maintenance of order, and the renewal of shared bonds. When a villager stood before the altar, bread and cheese in hand, the ordeal did not unfold in a private chamber. It was a communal drama, a ritual saturated with symbolism, designed as much to reassure the many as to judge the one. The trial by cheese and bread was often staged at the heart of the village's sacred space, the church. This was no accident. The church was not only a house of worship, but also the gathering hall, the archive of memory, and the visible anchor of communal identity. To hold the ordeal, there was to frame it in sacred terms, surrounding it with images of saints, relics, and the looming presence of the altar. The accused was not judged by a faceless authority, but by God, in full view of their neighbors. The sequence of the ordeal was infused with ritual solemnity. The accused fasted beforehand, an act of purification that heightened the sense of spiritual vulnerability. The bread and cheese, ordinary sustenance, were blessed by the priest, transfigured from common food into tokens of divine scrutiny. The accused swore an oath upon the altar, binding themselves to the truth of their testimony. Then came the act of eating, watched by the entire community. Each chew, each swallow, a silent liturgy in which guilt or innocence would be revealed. The communal presence was essential. This was not simply about determining fact, it was about healing suspicion. In tightly woven villages, suspicion could be poison. A rumor of theft, a whisper of heresy, a murmur of adultery, all could fester, dividing families, turning neighbor against neighbor. The ordeal provided a mechanism by which the uncertainty could be resolved. The outcome, whether swallowing succeeded or failed, was accepted as divine judgment, closing the matter and allowing the community to move forward. In this way, the ordeal acted as a kind of collective therapy, transforming private grievance into a public ritual of resolution. The ordeal also carried theatrical elements. Medieval communities were accustomed to performance. Mystery plays, saints' festivals, and processions filled the calendar. The ordeal slotted naturally into this rhythm. It was a drama of suspense. Would the accused choke or not? It was also a drama of moral teaching. The guilty exposed, the innocent vindicated. Villagers learned through it that truth was not hidden forever, that divine justice stood above human cunning. In a world where literacy was rare and law codes remote, such visible spectacles conveyed moral order more powerfully than written statutes ever could. The ordeal's communal nature also extended to feasting and fasting. In some places, the outcome of an ordeal was followed by a communal meal if the accused was acquitted, a feast of reconciliation where the once suspected was welcomed back into fellowship. Conversely, if the accused choked, the shame and punishment were shared as a collective burden, a stain on the village's harmony. In both cases, the ordeal linked law to the cycles of food, fellowship, and faith that bound medieval society together. Nor can one overlook the role of memory. An ordeal was not quickly forgotten. Tales of miraculous chokes or astonishing acquittals were repeated for generations, becoming part of local lore. A child might hear of the baker who falsely swore innocence and was struck down by bread. A farmer might recall his grandfather's vindication when he swallowed without faltering. These stories reinforced the ordeal's legitimacy and ensured that its moral lessons remained active long after the actual events had passed. The ordeal also functioned as a form of social theater for outsiders. In towns or market centers, strangers or travelers who witnessed such trials carried away stories that spread across regions. In this way, the ordeal's reputation grew far beyond the local village, acquiring a near-mythical status as a divine spectacle. Chroniclers occasionally recorded such trials, cementing them into the written memory of Christendom. Still, the ordeal was not merely entertainment or pedagogy, it was also a form of discipline. To stand in the church before one's neighbors was to endure the gaze of the community. Shame was a powerful tool in medieval life, and the ordeal heightened it. The accused bore not only the judgment of God but the stares, whispers, and expectations of their peers. This alone could coerce confessions or enforce conformity, even before the bread touched the lips. The ordeal thus reinforced social norms by dramatizing the consequences of deviation. Interestingly, the ordeal also reveals how medieval law blended seamlessly with religion. There was no stark division between sacred and secular, between altar and court. The same space where Mass was celebrated could, on another day, host a trial of bread and cheese. Justice and worship intertwined, and the community saw no contradiction. To them, God's law and man's law were one fabric, woven together in the rituals of daily life. It is worth noting, however, that not all communities embraced the ordeal with equal fervor. In some places, it was a last resort, used only when no witnesses or confessions could be found. In others, it was a more routine feature of local justice. Variations in practice reveal that, while the ordeal was widely known, it was also locally adapted. Each village, each town, framed the ordeal in its own traditions, festivals, and expectations, embedding it into the fabric of their communal life. Ultimately, the ordeal of cheese and bread shows us that medieval justice was never only about law. It was about community. It was about memory. It was about performance, healing, and belonging. To eat bread and cheese before an altar was not just to face divine judgment. It was to step into a drama in which the entire village participated, reaffirming their bonds through the visible presence of God's justice. In this way, the ordeal transcended its function as a legal test. It became ritual, theater, sacrament, and story, binding the community together with threads of awe, fear, and faith. The swallowing of bread was, for a brief moment, the swallowing of communal doubt itself, transforming uncertainty into certainty, suspicion into closure, and conflict into peace. In the world of medieval Europe, justice was never neutral. It was wielded, displayed, and contested by those who held power, whether monarchs, lords, or bishops. The ordeal of cheese and bread, humble as it may seem, became one more instrument in this theater of authority. Far from being a quaint local custom, it was woven into the political machinery of the Middle Ages, reflecting and reinforcing the hierarchies that defined the age. The ordeal itself was predicated on the idea that God revealed truth through material means. But who decided when the ordeal should be used, who officiated it, and who interpreted its outcome? These were not impartial choices. They were decisions made by local authorities, often aligning with broader currents of political interest. When a priest placed blessed bread and cheese in the mouth of an accused, it was not only God who judged. It was also the authority of the church, of the lord of the manor, of the entire system of governance in which the ritual took place. In many communities, the ordeal was authorized by the lord or overseen by his steward. To submit an accused thief or blasphemer to the ordeal was to reaffirm the lord's right to administer justice. It was a demonstration of his role not just as protector of land, but as arbiter of moral and spiritual order. The ordeal thus legitimized feudal authority, binding peasants to their lords not only in matters of rent and service, but also in questions of guilt and innocence. At the same time, the church wielded its own immense influence through the ordeal. Priests sanctified the bread and cheese, ensuring that divine judgment could be invoked. Without clerical blessing, the ordeal lost its spiritual force. This gave the church extraordinary leverage. It could refuse to participate, delay proceedings, or sway outcomes by its presence. In an age where excommunication could ruin lives and entire towns, the church's involvement in such ordeals made it indispensable to the machinery of justice. Kings, too, recognized the symbolic power of ordeals. Though trials by fire or water were more commonly mentioned in royal law codes, the ordeal of cheese and bread served a similar purpose in emphasizing divine sanction for judgment. Monarchs often permitted or endorsed these practices because they reinforced the notion that earthly rule operated under the shadow of heavenly justice. A guilty verdict, confirmed by God through choking, strengthened not only the immediate decision, but also the broader narrative that kings ruled by divine right. The ordeal could also be manipulated to achieve political ends. Consider a case in which a rebellious tenant was accused of theft, or a rival lord's supporter was suspected of treason. By subjecting them to the ordeal, an authority could cloak political punishment in the guise of divine judgment. If the accused choked, it was not because a factional enemy wished it so. It was because God himself had revealed guilt. In this way, ordeals provided a cloak of legitimacy for what were often politically motivated decisions. There are hints in chronicles of disputes over the use of such trials, particularly when outcomes appeared suspiciously aligned with the interests of the powerful. If an influential family's son miraculously swallowed without incident while a poor peasant choked, villagers could not help but notice. Yet the nature of the ordeal, its performance before God and the community, meant that dissent was difficult. To question the outcome was to question divine judgment, a perilous act in a world where blasphemy could itself invite punishment. The ordeal thus became a delicate balance of faith and control. The church and nobility needed it to appear genuine, a true revelation of God's will, even while they occasionally exploited it for advantage. Too much manipulation would undermine trust. Too little would leave power vulnerable. The ordeal's effectiveness depended on its credibility, and credibility required a careful management of ritual, spectacle, and interpretation. In some instances, ordeals became rallying points for broader struggles of authority. Disputes between secular lords and bishops over who held the right to administer such trials mirrored the larger tensions between throne and altar. The investiture controversies of the 11th and 12th centuries, though primarily about the appointment of bishops, reflected a deeper competition over where ultimate authority lay. The ordeal of bread and cheese, small as it was in scale, existed within this larger arena of contested sovereignty. Even the language surrounding the ordeal carried political weight. To call it the Judicium Dei, the judgment of God, was to frame law itself as subordinate to divine will. This placed kings, lords, and commoners alike under the same heavenly authority, but in practice it allowed those who officiated to claim they were executing not their own judgment, but God's. This blurred responsibility, making power harder to challenge. Who could argue against an outcome ordained by heaven? The ordeal also reveals the ways in which medieval societies maintained order without centralized police forces or bureaucratic courts. In a fractured world of castles, monasteries, and villages, ordeals provided a portable form of justice that required little infrastructure. A priest, an altar, a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese. These were accessible to even the smallest communities. Yet the outcome carried the full force of legitimacy, precisely because it was embedded in the broader hierarchies of church and lordship. The political uses of the ordeal also explain, in part, why it persisted despite its arbitrariness. Rational legal systems would later view it as superstition, but for medieval rulers, it worked. It reinforced their authority, maintained order, and cloaked decisions in unassailable divine sanction. Its continued use into the 12th and 13th centuries was not an accident, but a reflection of its political utility. At the same time, the ordeal demonstrates how power in the Middle Ages was rarely coercive alone. It was persuasive, symbolic, and ritualized. Authority was not simply enforced with swords. It was staged, dramatized, and sanctified. The ordeal of cheese and bread shows us this vividly. Law was theater, and theater was law, with power expressed not just in written charters, but in sacred performances watched by entire communities. In sum, the ordeal's political dimension is inseparable from its ritual and communal functions. It was a tool of governance as much as of justice, binding people to their rulers through fear, awe, and belief. Each choking mouthful or smooth swallow confirmed not only guilt or innocence, but also the authority of those who presided. In every trial, the bread and cheese carried the weight of power itself, ingested under the gaze of both God and man. In the medieval world, law and faith were not separate realms, but twin threads of the same tapestry. To understand the ordeal of cheese and bread, one must look beyond its outward ritual and peer into the theological imagination that sustained it. This was not merely an odd custom of choking or swallowing. It was, in the eyes of the faithful, a profound sacramental moment when God's will was revealed through the simplest of substances. At its core, the ordeal drew upon a fundamental belief that God was active in the world, not as a distant creator who wound the clock of the universe and stepped away, but as an ever-present judge and guide. To eat consecrated bread and cheese was not simply to test digestion. It was to submit one's body as the stage upon which divine justice would play out. The outcome was not random, but was believed to be infused with God's discernment. The bread itself carried immense spiritual resonance. In the Christian imagination, bread was never just food. From the manna that fell in the desert to the bread broken at the Last Supper, it symbolized both sustenance and divine promise. To consume bread in the ordeal was to enter a sacred dialogue with God, echoing the Eucharist where Christ's presence was invoked. The ordeal was not the Eucharist itself, but it borrowed from its symbolic weight, lending the act a sacramental gravity. To choke on bread was to be rejected by God, while to swallow smoothly was to be vindicated by him. Cheese, too, though more humble, bore its own resonance. Medieval theologians often saw cheese as the transformation of milk, The nourishment of the infant turned into solid food for the mature. It was a symbol of growth, of God's bounty made firm. When paired with bread, it created a holy balance of sustenance, the very stuff of daily survival in agrarian societies. Thus, the pairing was not arbitrary but carried spiritual symbolism that the medieval mind could readily grasp. Theologically, the ordeal rested on the doctrine of divine providence. God was believed to govern all things, great and small, and thus he would not allow an innocent person to choke unjustly. To modern eyes, this seems fragile logic, but in an age of faith, it was profoundly compelling. If God numbered the hairs on one's head, surely he could guide a morsel of bread past the throat of the innocent or lodge it fatally in the throat of the guilty. Clerics often framed the ordeal as a prayerful act, one accompanied by liturgies, blessings, and invocations. The bread and cheese were laid upon the altar, sanctified by sacred words, and only then given to the accused. This ensured that the trial was conducted not as a casual test, but as a ritual embedded in the sacred order of the Church. It was not human digestion being measured, it was divine intervention being sought. The altar served as the pivot, ensuring that God himself was invited to judge. The theology behind the ordeal also reveals the medieval fascination with the sacramental body. In the medieval worldview, the body was not merely physical, it was a vessel for spiritual truths. Illness could be seen as punishment for sin, healing as a sign of grace. The choking throat was thus not an accident, but a revelation. The body became a text to be read, a canvas upon which God inscribed his verdict. The ordeal, in this sense, was a sacred drama of the body, an embodied theology enacted before witnesses. It is important, however, to recognize that not all theologians were comfortable with such ordeals. Some questioned whether it was fitting to ask God for miraculous signs in matters of everyday justice. Augustine had cautioned against testing God, and later scholastic thinkers like Thomas Aquinas would express skepticism about relying on miracles as instruments of law. Yet the persistence of the ordeal suggests that for many, the theological rationale remained persuasive. God was not being tested, he was being invited to reveal what he already knew. The ordeal also reflected medieval understandings of oath-taking and truth. To eat bread and cheese upon the altar was, in effect, to swear an oath in the most literal sense. By consuming the sacred, one bound oneself to God's judgment. If guilty, the accused risked not only temporal punishment, but spiritual damnation. The act thus fused theology and law in a way that was deeply meaningful to participants, binding their eternal fate to their earthly trial. From a theological lens, the ordeal of cheese and bread also mirrored the cosmic struggle between good and evil. In the innocent, God triumphed, allowing bread to nourish and sustain. In the guilty, the devil was thought to have power, causing the throat to constrict and life itself to be threatened. Thus, each ordeal was not only a legal proceeding, but a microcosm of the great spiritual war unfolding across time. Liturgical texts and sermons often reinforced this logic, reminding communities that God was just and that his justice would be revealed through signs. For the ordinary villager, who lived in a world where every harvest depended on prayer, where storms and plagues were seen as divine messages, the idea that bread and cheese could reveal guilt or innocence was not absurd. It was entirely consistent with the rhythms of faith. The ordeal was also connected to broader medieval ideas about miracle and relic. Just as relics were believed to heal or punish depending on one's worthiness, so the ordeal was thought to reveal one's true standing before God. Both relied on the same theological assumption, that the sacred could intervene in the mundane, that divine justice could be made visible through material means. Yet, like many aspects of medieval spirituality, the ordeal of cheese and bread carried ambiguities. It was never codified with the same rigor as the Eucharist, nor was it universally practiced across Christendom. Some dioceses embraced it, others avoided it, and still others modified it. This variability points to a theology not of strict dogma, but of lived faith, flexible, pragmatic, and rooted in the needs of local communities. What is undeniable is that theology gave the ordeal its backbone. Without the belief that God actively judged through bread and cheese, the practice could not have carried the authority it did. Faith transformed ordinary food into a divine instrument, and theology wrapped the act in layers of meaning that gave it legitimacy. It was not superstition alone, but part of a coherent worldview in which heaven and earth constantly touched. In contemplating this, one is reminded that medieval theology was not abstract speculation locked in monasteries. It was lived, embodied, enacted. The Ordeal of Cheese and Bread reveals a theology not only written in books, but performed in rituals, spoken in blessings, and consumed in food. It was theology you could taste, theology that could choke or absolve, theology that bound the fate of souls to the swallowing of bread. Thus, the Ordeal stands as a testament to the medieval conviction that God was near, that his will could be known, and that justice, in the end, was not merely human but divine. In the medieval village, the trial by cheese and bread was not a private ritual conducted in shadows. It unfolded before the watchful eyes of a community, and in those eyes lay both judgment and absolution. The ordeal was a spectacle, part courtroom, part sacrament, part theater of fear, where the collective presence of neighbors, kin, priests, and lords infused the act with meaning far greater than the swallowing of food. For the accused, the weight of the community's gaze was crushing. To stand before the altar with bread and cheese in hand was to stand before one's entire social world. The farmer who had quarreled over land, the widow whose sheep had gone missing, the children whispering in corners, all were present, watching with bated breath. Guilt or innocence was not just a private condition. It was a communal truth that would reshape relationships, reputations, and even survival within the village. The ordeal was never silent. Before the ritual, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Speculation passed from lip to lip. Some whispered of prior quarrels, of signs of guilt or innocence. Others prayed, hoping that God's justice would be made visible. In this way, the ordeal fed into the social fabric. It was not only about the accused, but also about reaffirming the community's faith in divine order. When the priest blessed the bread and cheese, it was as if the entire village was offering its trust to God. The ritual itself was laden with drama. The accused approached the altar, perhaps pale with fear, perhaps defiant in their innocence. The priest intoned sacred words, sanctifying the food, and placed it before the accused. The moment of eating became a suspension of time. Silence often fell as eyes fixed on the mouth, the throat, the body language of the accused. Each swallow was magnified into an omen. If the bread passed smoothly, relief washed over the community. If choking ensued, horror and vindication erupted simultaneously. Innocence or guilt was not simply an individual matter. It was a communal narrative. A smooth swallow could restore harmony, heal divisions, and reaffirm trust among neighbors. But a choking throat confirmed suspicions, intensified divisions, and sometimes unleashed vengeance. Justice in this sense was both divine and social, for it restored balance not only between the accused and God, but also within the fabric of human relationships. The ordeal also revealed the medieval community's hunger for visible signs. In a world where literacy was scarce and records minimal, justice needed to be embodied, enacted, and witnessed. To see someone choke or swallow was proof enough, a tangible verdict in a society that mistrusted abstraction. The ordeal was thus as much about communal reassurance as it was about divine revelation. Without witnesses, the act would lose its legitimacy. With witnesses, it became law. Fear was a constant companion of these gatherings. The accused feared condemnation. The onlookers feared the possibility that God might punish the entire community if they allowed guilt to go unpunished. To live in a medieval village was to live in constant negotiation with divine justice. Droughts, plagues, and storms were read as signs of divine displeasure. Thus, the ordeal was not merely about one person. It was about ensuring the spiritual safety of all. A guilty person unpunished was a threat to the entire village, a source of divine wrath. At the same time, the ordeal provided a stage for communal catharsis. Grievances that had festered in whispers could find resolution in the public spectacle. If someone accused of theft was vindicated, the murmurs of suspicion were silenced, and reconciliation could be attempted. If guilt was revealed, the community could unite in condemning the wrongdoer, channeling their fears and frustrations into a collective verdict. In this way, the ordeal both divided and united, shaping the social order through ritualized judgment. The role of the priest was crucial in managing this communal theater. His words sanctified the act, but they also framed the narrative for the crowd. Through prayers and invocations, he reminded the onlookers that this was not mere chance, but divine will. His presence gave the ordeal moral gravity, ensuring that the verdict, whatever it was, carried spiritual legitimacy. Without the priest, the act risked being dismissed as superstition. With him, it became sacred drama. Children, too, were often present, absorbing the lesson that justice was not hidden in books but enacted in flesh. For them, the ordeal became a formative memory, teaching them that God's will was visible, tangible, and fearful. Stories of choking or smooth swallowing were retold around hearths, embedding the ordeal into the oral tradition of the community. In this way, the ordeal's significance extended beyond the immediate event, shaping cultural memory across generations. The ordeal's communal dimension also highlights the precariousness of medieval life. In small villages where everyone depended on each other for survival, whether in harvesting fields, defending against raiders, or enduring harsh winters, trust was essential. A thief, liar, or murderer threatened not only individuals but the collective stability. The ordeal was thus a means of repairing or severing bonds of trust, ensuring that the community could continue to function. At times, the ordeal could reveal the tension between local gossip and divine verdict. If someone widely suspected of guilt managed to swallow smoothly, unease could ripple through the crowd. Was the person truly innocent, or had the devil aided them? If someone beloved by the community choked, sorrow and confusion might follow. In such cases, priests and leaders had to carefully interpret the outcome, weaving it into a narrative that preserved faith in divine justice while also maintaining social cohesion. The ordeal of cheese and bread, then, was never just about one individual. It was about the village itself, the community's relationship with God, and the reassurance that justice was being done in a visible, tangible way. Every trial was a communal act of reaffirming faith, of placing collective trust in God's judgment, and of reweaving the social fabric strained by crime or accusation. To modern eyes, the idea of watching someone choke or swallow as a form of justice seems strange, even cruel. But for medieval communities, it was profoundly logical. It united law, faith, and society in a single event, transforming food into a divine instrument and the body into a sacred stage. In the gaze of the community, the ordeal became more than trial. It became revelation. The ordeal of cheese and bread may have flourished in village churches and parish communities, but its significance was never confined to the local level. It was a reflection of how divine judgment could intersect with the machinery of earthly authority, a ritual that served the interests of lords, barons, and kings as much as priests and peasants. Justice in the Middle Ages was not uniform. It varied from manor to manor, from shire to shire. Yet the ordeal of cheese and bread provided a shared language of truth, one that rulers could harness to legitimize their rule and extend their influence. The great landlords of medieval Europe were not indifferent to local quarrels. A theft of grain, an accusation of adultery, or a charge of sacrilege all touched on the stability of their estates. When disputes threatened the productivity of fields or the loyalty of vassals, lords often looked to rituals like the ordeal to restore order. The beauty of the cheese and bread trial was its accessibility. It required no elaborate equipment, only a priest, an altar, and the accused. For lords seeking to maintain peace without endless litigation, the ordeal was a gift. It offered visible closure and divine sanction, sparing them the burden of appearing arbitrary. In the broader context of royal justice, the ordeal functioned as a tool of kingship. Monarchs across Europe claimed to be God's anointed rulers, responsible for upholding both earthly and divine law. To allow trials by ordeal was to reinforce that claim. When a subject was judged guilty or innocent through bread and cheese, it confirmed that the king's justice was also God's justice. Records from royal courts suggest that ordeals were sometimes permitted as a supplement to sworn testimony, particularly in cases where evidence was thin. The ordeal thus filled a gap in the legal process, offering kings a way to adjudicate disputes without exposing the crown to accusations of bias. Yet royal reliance on ordeal justice was not without its tensions. Kings, unlike village priests, had to maintain not only the loyalty of their subjects but also the respect of their peers, clergy, and foreign rulers. As European kingdoms grew more centralized in the 12th and 13th centuries, monarchs began to codify laws, establish courts, and issue written decrees. The simplicity of the ordeal of cheese and bread, once so useful, came to look rustic, even embarrassing. Still, in remote regions and frontier lands, it endured as a symbol of continuity between divine order and royal will. The church, too, played a crucial role in shaping how lords and kings viewed the ordeal. While local priests blessed the bread and cheese, bishops and archbishops debated whether such rituals truly reflected God's will. Theologians worried that reliance on ordeals blurred the line between faith and superstition. If the accused swallowed smoothly, was that truly God's judgment, or was it the natural resilience of the body? If they choked, was it divine punishment or simple nerves? These debates grew sharper as kings expanded their authority, for royal courts needed forms of justice that appeared rational and credible to both nobles and clerics. Nevertheless, many rulers found the ordeal politically convenient. To allow a community to stage a trial by cheese and bread was to allow people to see divine justice unfold, reinforcing loyalty to both church and crown. Lords could point to the ordeal and say, "See, God himself has judged." This was especially valuable in times of unrest, when doubts about justice could ignite rebellion. In a world where revolt often simmered just beneath the surface, rituals that closed disputes visibly and conclusively were indispensable. Consider the role of ordeal justice in frontier regions, such as the borderlands between England and Scotland or the marches of the Holy Roman Empire. In these unstable zones, where law was patchy and violence common, ordeals like the trial by cheese and bread were a means of asserting order. Lords who lacked the resources to maintain complex courts relied on such rituals to settle disputes quickly. The accused might be a cattle thief, a suspected spy, or even a villager accused of harboring bandits. Whatever the case, the ordeal gave the appearance that divine truth was being revealed, strengthening the hand of secular power. But the very simplicity of the ordeal eventually became its undoing. By the 13th century, as kingdoms like England under Henry II and France under Louis IX sought to professionalize justice, the ordeal appeared increasingly archaic. The rise of juries, written records, and trained judges provided alternatives that kings found more reliable and, crucially, more demonstrable to outsiders. Yet the memory of the ordeal lingered, especially among common people. Even as royal decrees restricted its use, local lords sometimes permitted it in defiance of canon law, believing that their peasants trusted it more than written testimony. It is telling that when the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 officially forbade clergy from participating in ordeals, it marked a decisive moment in the history of justice. Without priests to bless the bread and cheese, the ordeal could not function. Kings were forced to develop new systems of adjudication, leading to the expansion of juries and the slow emergence of common law traditions. Yet even as the ordeal faded from royal courts, its echoes remained. Chronicles record villagers continuing to stage ordeals in secret, clinging to the belief that God still spoke through bread and cheese. What this reveals is that the ordeal of cheese and bread was never simply a local curiosity. It was part of a wider struggle over the nature of justice in medieval Europe, a struggle between custom and codification, between divine will and human law, between the authority of priests and the power of kings. For centuries, lords and monarchs relied on its symbolism to stabilize their realms. And even as it declined, it left a legacy of communal justice and divine sanction that shaped how medieval people understood the relationship between heaven and earth. In the shadow of castles and in the halls of kings, the ordeal of cheese and bread served as a bridge between the sacred and the secular. It was not merely a village ritual, but a tool of governance, a performance of divine legitimacy that bound subjects to their rulers. Its eventual disappearance marked a turning point. The end of a world where justice was visible in a swallow, and the beginning of a world where justice was written in law. As medieval Europe entered the 12th and 13th centuries, the ordeal of cheese and bread stood at a crossroads. For centuries, it had offered communities a visible ritual of judgment, a way to summon divine truth in the absence of evidence or confession. But the intellectual and spiritual climate was changing. Theologians, scholars, and reform-minded church leaders increasingly questioned whether such practices truly reflected God's will, or whether they were relics of superstition dressed in clerical robes. The ordeal's defenders argued that God would never abandon the innocent, that his power extended to every crumb of consecrated bread and every swallow of the accused. But its critics pointed to theology itself. If God was omnipotent, why should he be bound to reveal his will through a human stomach? Could mortal judges presume to force divine intervention on command? The debate intensified in universities and monastic schools, where the intellectual revival of the High Middle Ages brought new methods of reasoning. Scholars like Peter Abelard and his successors applied logic and dialectic to questions of law and theology, scrutinizing practices that earlier generations had taken for granted. The ordeal of cheese and bread, with its reliance on choking as proof of guilt, did not stand up well under rational examination. Was it truly divine judgment, or was it simply the workings of nerves, fear, and physiology? Medieval scholars, some trained in medicine as well as theology, noted that stress could tighten the throat, causing even the innocent to gag. Others observed that hunger, dryness of mouth, or even the way the bread was baked could affect swallowing. Such reasoning threatened the foundation of the ordeal. If natural causes could explain failure, then divine judgment was no longer guaranteed. Yet belief in ordeals was not easily dismantled. They were woven into the fabric of community life, endorsed by priests and accepted by peasants. To reject them outright was to risk alienating the faithful. Thus, critics often advanced their arguments cautiously, emphasizing not the futility of divine judgment, but the danger of presumption. Theologians warned that it was sinful to compel God to act through human rituals. To demand a sign in bread and cheese was to tempt the Almighty, to misuse his sacraments for human ends. Such arguments gained traction in clerical circles, especially among reform movements that sought to purify the Church of questionable practices. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 marked a turning point. Convened under Pope Innocent III, the council issued sweeping decrees on doctrine, pastoral care, and clerical discipline. Among its many reforms was a ruling that priests should no longer participate in ordeals. Without the blessing of clergy, the ordeal of cheese and bread lost its legitimacy. This decree reflected not only theological concerns, but also political pressures. The papacy, seeking to centralize authority, recognized that ordeals allowed local communities and secular lords to bypass canonical courts. By forbidding clerical involvement, the Church asserted greater control over justice and aligned itself with the growing movement toward rationalized legal systems. But while the council's ruling weakened the ordeal in official settings, it did not erase it overnight. In villages far from the centers of power, the trial by cheese and bread lingered, sustained by custom and belief. Chroniclers record episodes of villagers staging ordeals in defiance of canon law, insisting that God's judgment could still be summoned. For many commoners, the alternatives offered by royal courts, juries, written documents, and formal procedures were alien and untrustworthy. The ordeal remained familiar, accessible, and, most importantly, visible. Justice written in parchment could be manipulated by the literate and powerful. Justice revealed that the altar was plain to all. Even as official doctrine shifted, scholars continued to wrestle with the ordeal's meaning. Some argued that its persistence revealed a deeper truth about human nature. People yearned for justice that was immediate and unquestionable. Others suggested that the ordeal, though flawed, was a reflection of faith itself, a reminder that divine power infused every aspect of life. In this sense, the ordeal was less a legal mechanism than a theological drama, a ritual that made visible the medieval conviction that God was present in every trial, every meal, every breath. Medical writers, too, entered the debate. As knowledge of the human body expanded through translations of Arabic and classical texts, physicians proposed natural explanations for what the ordeal had long treated as supernatural. The act of swallowing bread and cheese, they observed, depended on the moistness of the throat, the texture of the food, and the emotional state of the eater. Fear could cause dryness of mouth. Panic could constrict the throat. Thus, choking was not a sign of guilt, but of human frailty. Such insights further undermined confidence in the ordeal, offering explanations that bypassed divine judgment altogether. Yet these critiques did not erase the ordeal's cultural power. The image of an accused standing before an altar, clutching bread and cheese, was deeply ingrained in medieval imagination. Literature, sermons, and popular tales continued to reference the ordeal as a symbol of divine justice. In some stories, miraculous swallowing revealed innocence. In others, choking exposed hidden guilt. These narratives preserved the ordeal in memory even as it faded from practice, reminding listeners of a time when God's hand could be seen in every bite. The ordeal of cheese and bread thus became a flashpoint in the broader transformation of medieval justice. It embodied the tensions between faith and reason, tradition and reform, local custom and centralized authority. Its critics challenged not only a ritual, but a worldview. The belief that divine will could be summoned on command through physical signs. By questioning this assumption, theologians and scholars opened the door to new forms of justice, grounded not in ritual, but in evidence, testimony, and rational inquiry. Still, the ordeal's decline did not erase the longing it once fulfilled. Even as juries and written laws became standard, communities continued to crave visible proof of guilt or innocence. The ordeal had offered closure, a dramatic moment when truth was revealed beyond dispute. The new systems of justice, with their procedures and ambiguities, could not always provide the same certainty. This tension between the desire for absolute judgment and the reality of human law would endure long after the last crumbs of bread and cheese had been swallowed. In the end, the ordeal of cheese and bread was undone not by ridicule, but by reasoned critique. Theologians condemned it as presumption, scholars dissected its logic, physicians explained its effects, and reformers sought more controlled forms of justice. Yet its very persistence, even after condemnation, reveals its deep resonance. It was a ritual that made divine justice tangible, and in a world where written law often seemed distant, it gave people a way to believe that heaven itself cared about their disputes. The ordeal's critics may have won the argument, but they could not erase the memory of a justice so immediate, so embodied, that it lived on in story and imagination long after its practice had ceased. When the authority of the Church withdrew from ordeals in the early 13th century, the old ritual of cheese and bread entered its twilight. Yet its decline was not instantaneous. In remote villages and smaller towns, where literacy was scarce and written documents scarce rarer still, the ordeal lingered. It was familiar, dramatic, and publicly legible. But without the sanction of priests, it increasingly stood in tension with the reforms of both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. In its place, new forms of justice began to take root, reshaping not only legal practice, but also the relationship between faith and law, individual and community. The vacuum left by the ordeal was quickly noticed. Across Europe, monarchs and lords sought more stable and standardized means of adjudication. The rise of centralized kingdoms required systems of justice that could be replicated across hundreds of towns, not dependent on local customs or divine signs. It was in this context that juries, inquests, and written records gained prominence. England, under the influence of Norman governance, had already begun experimenting with juries, groups of local men sworn to declare the truth of a matter by the 12th century. These institutions gained greater authority precisely as the ordeal declined. What had once been decided by a man's ability to swallow bread and cheese in front of an altar was now determined by the testimony of neighbors, recorded in parchment rolls, preserved in royal archives. This transition was not without resistance. For centuries, people had trusted their fates to visible rituals. They could see a man swallow or choke. They could witness fire burn or not burn. But how could they trust the deliberations of a dozen men behind closed doors? How could ink on parchment bear the same authority as the hand of God? Communities had to adjust to the idea that justice would no longer be delivered in a single dramatic moment, but through processes that unfolded across time. hearings, testimonies, deliberations. It required a new kind of faith, not in miraculous intervention, but in human reason and institutional order. The ordeal of cheese and bread, in particular, presented a striking contrast to emerging methods. It had always been tied to the sacred space of the church, presided over by priests, centered on consecrated bread. Its disappearance symbolized a larger shift, the movement of justice out of sacred precincts and into the halls of kings, parliaments, and secular courts. The sacred was giving way to the administrative. God's judgment was being supplanted by human judgment, fallible but methodical. By the 14th century, ordeals had virtually vanished from official legal systems. Records of their use became rarer, surviving mostly as echoes in folklore and memory. In England, chroniclers noted their disappearance with curiosity, while legal scholars quietly moved on to refining jury procedure and codifying royal writs. On the continent, Roman and canon law traditions provided alternative frameworks, emphasizing written contracts, rational evidence, and the authority of magistrates. The ordeal, once central to community life, became a vestige of a vanished worldview. Yet, as with many cultural shifts, the memory lingered. Even as juries rose, traces of ordeal logic persisted in the ways people thought about justice. The very idea of proof carried the residue of earlier rituals. It was still imagined as something absolute, decisive, unambiguous. Trials, even when conducted with testimony and evidence, were expected to deliver certainty, an echo of the moment when bread and cheese could separate innocence from guilt. This expectation sometimes clashed with reality. As human testimony was contradictory, written records could be forged and juries could be swayed. But the longing for a form of justice that was visible and unquestionable never fully disappeared. Historians often frame this transition as a triumph of rationality over superstition, but that narrative oversimplifies. The ordeal was not abandoned because people stopped believing in God. It was abandoned because institutions demanded new forms of control. The papacy needed to assert its authority. Monarchs required legal systems that could be replicated across territories. Scholars insisted on intellectual coherence, and communities gradually adapted to bureaucratic governance. The ordeal's decline was thus less about faith fading than about power shifting. In some corners of Europe, however, the ordeal of cheese and bread lingered into later centuries as folklore rather than law. Tales circulated of peasants demanding God's judgment through food, of accused men refusing to eat in fear of choking, of miraculous swallowings that vindicated the innocent. These stories kept the ordeal alive in cultural memory, even as official courts turned elsewhere. The ritual retained symbolic power. It evoked a world where justice was immediate, sacred, and visible to all. The transition also reveals the deep adaptability of medieval societies. Where one form of justice faded, another was constructed. Where communities once crowded into churches to watch bread and cheese swallowed, they now gathered in market squares to hear verdicts read aloud from parchment. Where priests once blessed altars for ordeals, royal clerks now sealed documents with wax. Justice remained public, but its form shifted from ritual drama to administrative performance. The end of the ordeal of cheese and bread thus stands as both a conclusion and a beginning. It marked the close of a chapter in which divine will was summoned through sacramental food, and the opening of a new chapter in which human institutions sought to embody order and truth. Its decline illuminates the broader currents of medieval life. The rise of centralized monarchies, the rationalizing impulse of universities, the reforming zeal of the church, and the resilience of communities adapting to new systems. Still, it is worth remembering that the ordeal did not vanish because it lacked meaning, but precisely because it had too much of it. It demanded certainty in a world that was becoming more complex. It embodied a theology that reformers feared was presumptuous. It symbolized local autonomy in an age of centralization. Its disappearance was a sign not of irrelevance, but of transformation. The bread and cheese of ordeal were not forgotten. They were absorbed into the evolving imagination of justice, leaving behind traces that echo in our own longing for clear verdicts and undeniable truth. By the late Middle Ages, the ordeal of cheese and bread existed only as a memory, a story told by chroniclers, a relic of a world where the divine and the mundane were inseparable. Its absence, however, reshaped how justice was imagined. Where once people trusted their fates to swallowing, they now looked to written law, juries, and courts. The stage of justice had changed, but the drama, the desire for certainty, for divine assurance, remained the same. Even after the ordeal of cheese and bread vanished from official records and secular justice systems, it refused to disappear entirely. Instead, it found new life in memory, story, and imagination. Across Europe, in villages where oral tradition flourished, tales of the ordeal were retold around hearths, embroidered into legends, and reinterpreted as cautionary parables. The ritual, once a solemn test of divine judgment, became a symbol of both fear and fascination, hovering between history and folklore. In many accounts, the ordeal was remembered with a mixture of awe and dread. Elders recounted stories of ancestors who had stood trembling before the altar, bread in hand, as the fate of their soul hung upon the act of swallowing. These tales often exaggerated the drama, bread swelling in the throat like a stone, cheese transforming into a lump impossible to chew, entire congregations gasping as guilt revealed itself in choking gasps. Such retellings amplified the ordeal's tension, transforming a ritual of law into a theater of morality. Children listening to such stories grew up not with knowledge of legal procedure, but with an almost mythic understanding of divine justice, where God's hand reached directly into the throat to expose lies. Ballads and songs sometimes immortalized the ordeal. In rustic rhymes sung during feasts, verses hinted at the bread that choked the liar, or the cheese that cleared the pure of heart. These fragments, while often humorous or satirical, preserve the cultural memory of the ritual long after it ceased to be practiced. Some minstrels used the ordeal as metaphor. A deceitful lover might be compared to one who cannot swallow truth, while a faithful knight might be praised as one who swallowed clean. What had once been a legal ordeal thus became poetic imagery, woven into the symbolic language of medieval and early modern life. In literature, too, the ordeal appeared. Chronicles occasionally referenced it in passing, as if to mark the quaintness of older times. Storytellers used it to heighten the stakes of moral dramas. In miracle collections and saints' lives, the ordeal could be repurposed as proof of divine intervention, the guilty choking until a holy relic relieved them, or the innocent swallowing smoothly after invoking the Virgin. Whether intended as entertainment or edification, such stories kept alive the association between food, truth, and divine judgment. Perhaps most fascinating was the ordeal's place in superstition and popular belief. Some communities whispered that bread itself could reveal guilt outside formal ritual. A stolen loaf placed under a thief's pillow would prevent him from sleeping. A piece of cheese blessed by a priest could supposedly cause liars to cough when they attempted deceit. Though these practices were never sanctioned by church or crown, they reflect how deeply the logic of the ordeal had penetrated the imagination. People continued to see food not merely as sustenance, but as a vessel for moral truth. The ordeal also lived on in satire. In the ribald humor of marketplaces and taverns, jokes circulated about greedy men who failed the test simply because they tried to swallow too quickly, or drunkards who choked on cheese regardless of guilt. These jokes reveal both skepticism and fondness, laughter at the ordeal's absurdities, but also recognition of its dramatic power. It remained a touchstone for humor because it was so well known, so universally grasped, that everyone could understand the joke. By the early modern period, antiquarians and scholars began to collect these stories. To them, the ordeal seemed like a window into a credulous past, evidence of how their ancestors lived in superstition. Writers in the Renaissance often mocked it as an example of medieval folly, contrasting their own enlightened era with the darkness of old customs. Yet, even as they ridiculed it, they preserved its memory, ensuring that the ordeal of cheese and bread was not forgotten. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Romanticism swept Europe, interest in medieval rituals revived. Writers and historians sought out tales of ordeal as symbols of a more authentic, faith-filled past. Artists painted scenes of accused peasants before the altar, priests holding bread and cheese with solemn gravity. Poets revived the ordeal as metaphor for truth under trial. What rationalist reformers had scorned, romantic dreamers embraced as mystery and drama. The ordeal had traveled from law to lore, from courtroom to canvas. Even today, the ordeal of cheese and bread survives in fragments of popular imagination. It sometimes appears in novels, historical dramas, or fantasy works as a symbol of a society in which truth is not hidden but made manifest in ritual. Tourists in European towns where medieval courts once stood may encounter references to it in museums or exhibitions. For many, the ordeal seems bizarre, grotesque even, but also compelling, precisely because it reveals the strangeness of past societies and the depth of their faith in divine intervention. The persistence of memory reveals something profound about culture. Rituals do not die simply because they are outlawed. They leave traces, reshaped as story, joke, metaphor, or moral tale. The ordeal of cheese and bread ceased to function as law, but it continued to live as symbol. Its power lay not in its factual accuracy, whether or not people truly choked, but in the cultural imagination it ignited. In remembering it, communities could talk about justice, about God, about the fragility of human life. Folklorists suggest that the ordeal may even have influenced fairy tales. Stories of magical food that reveals truth or punishes deceit echo the same logic. The apple that sticks in a villain's throat, the cake that burns the liar's tongue, the enchanted meal that cannot be eaten by the wicked, all bear faint resemblance to the ordeal of cheese and bread. Whether by direct transmission or by shared symbolic logic, the ordeal's themes bled into the wider narrative fabric of Europe. Thus, while the ordeal faded from law, it thrived in imagination. From sacred ritual to folklore, from courtroom to ballad, it traveled across centuries in new forms. Its survival in memory suggests that humanity is reluctant to abandon rituals of certainty, even when reason renders them obsolete. The bread and cheese may no longer choke the guilty in churches, but they still live in stories, metaphors, and cultural echoes, reminding us of a time when divine justice was expected to manifest in the simplest of human acts, eating. The ordeal of cheese and bread, once a solemn ritual, later a story of superstition, has in the modern age become the subject of careful scrutiny by historians, legal scholars, anthropologists, and even theologians. To contemporary eyes, it appears strange, bordering on absurd, a justice system reduced to a test of swallowing food. Yet for scholars, the ordeal is not merely a curiosity. It is a keyhole into the world of medieval thought, revealing how societies structured around faith and fear of God attempted to reconcile uncertainty with truth. In revisiting the ordeal, modern scholarship uncovers not only its historical mechanics, but also its psychological and cultural significance. Historians of law are often the first to frame the ordeal within the broader tapestry of medieval jurisprudence. For them, the ordeal of cheese and bread was one branch of the family of ordeals that characterized early European justice. From the ordeal of fire, where accused walked across glowing embers, to the ordeal of water, where suspects were thrown into rivers to see if they floated, ordeals all rested on a singular principle: God would reveal the truth. The cheese and bread ordeal was unique in its use of food, aligning it not with the raw elements of fire and water, but with the altar and the act of communion. Legal historians see in this a symbolic fusion of law and liturgy. It was less about bodily trial and more about invoking divine presence through sacred consumption. Anthropologists, in contrast, tend to interpret the ordeal as ritual performance. For them, its value lay less in the outcome, whether or not someone choked, and more in the shared spectacle. Communities gathered, priests officiated, and the accused stood in trembling suspense. The ritual dramatized the community's collective belief in divine justice, reaffirming shared values. Whether the accused swallowed or not was almost secondary. The ordeal itself was the stage upon which society reenacted its deepest convictions. In this light, the ordeal is seen not as primitive law but as sacred theater, a performance binding communities together. Theologians approach it differently still. Some modern Christian scholars regard the ordeal as a misapplication of sacred symbols, a distortion of the Eucharist's meaning. For them, The idea that bread and cheese could reveal guilt through choking borders on sacrilege, blending superstition with holy ritual. Yet others argue that it reflects the medieval mindset that blurred sacred and secular, where God was expected to act not only in churches, but in courts, markets, and battlefields. From this perspective, the ordeal reveals a sincere, if misguided, attempt to invite divine judgment into daily life. Medical historians have also weighed in, particularly on the physiological plausibility of the ordeal. Could stress and fear truly cause someone to choke, regardless of guilt? Modern psychology suggests it could. Under conditions of extreme anxiety, the throat constricts, saliva dries, and swallowing becomes difficult. The accused, already terrified by the gravity of the moment, may well have found it physically challenging to eat dry bread and cheese before a silent congregation. Thus, the ordeal may have worked in practice, not because of divine intervention, but because fear itself betrayed the guilty or even the innocent. This convergence of ritual and physiology fascinates scholars, for it reveals how ancient systems of justice sometimes aligned unconsciously with natural human responses. Folklorists continue to trace the ordeal's afterlife in story and imagination. They emphasize how deeply its logic resonated with symbolic systems in European culture, the act of eating as a test of moral truth, food as the medium of divine revelation. In their studies, the ordeal is connected to myths of enchanted food, fairy tales of cursed banquets, and proverbs about swallowing lies. These links demonstrate that the ordeal was never an isolated practice, but part of a much broader symbolic vocabulary. Archaeologists, though less frequently involved, occasionally contribute by studying sites where ordeals were known to occur. Some churches that hosted trials by cheese and bread have been identified, their altars still intact, their records preserved. While no physical traces of the bread or cheese remain, the architecture itself tells part of the story. Sacred spaces doubling as courts, justice literally performed in the shadow of the cross. In recent decades, interdisciplinary scholarship has deepened our understanding of the ordeal. Legal historians collaborate with anthropologists, theologians with psychologists, each offering different angles on why societies embraced such rituals. Together, they suggest that the ordeal was not simply about credulity or superstition, but about the need for certainty in a world of limited evidence. Medieval societies lacked forensic science, surveillance, and modern bureaucracy. Faced with crimes where testimony was murky and evidence scarce, communities turned to God, the ultimate witness, to decide. The ordeal of cheese and bread was one such invocation of divine certainty. Yet modern scholars also acknowledge the ordeal's dangers. Innocent people could suffer, condemned by nerves or misfortune. The reliance on ritual over reason highlights the fragility of medieval justice. For this reason, many scholars see the ordeal as both fascinating and troubling, a reminder of how human societies crave certainty but often achieve it through flawed means. The ordeal has even drawn attention from comparative scholars who study other cultures' methods of divining truth. Across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, rituals have existed where guilt was tested through ordeals, drinking special potions, walking on hot coals, or enduring sacred trials. By situating the ordeal of cheese and bread within this global context, scholars argue that it reflects a universal human impulse to collapse the uncertainty of justice into a single, decisive act of divine or supernatural revelation. Interestingly, some modern scholars also connect the ordeal to contemporary systems of justice and truth-finding. While we no longer rely on bread and cheese, we still construct rituals of judgment, courtrooms with solemn oaths, juries deliberating behind closed doors, polygraph tests that measure stress responses. In each case, truth is sought not only through evidence, but also through performance and belief. The ordeal of cheese and bread, then, is less alien than it seems. It is a distant ancestor of our own ongoing search for certainty. The ordeal has also inspired artistic and cultural revivals. Historians stage reenactments for educational purposes, dramatizing the tense moment when bread and cheese are placed on the altar. Writers and filmmakers have borrowed the ordeal as symbol or scene, fascinated by its blend of the sacred and the grotesque. In these modern representations, the ordeal becomes less a relic of superstition and more a mirror of our fascination with the intersection of faith, fear, and justice. In the end, modern scholarship treats the ordeal with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and respect. It is easy to dismiss it as absurd, a legal system reduced to a meal. Yet to do so risks arrogance. The ordeal was, for its time, a sincere attempt to solve the insoluble. By studying it carefully, scholars not only reconstruct a lost world, but also confront enduring questions. How do societies decide guilt when evidence is uncertain? How does belief shape justice? How does fear interact with truth? The ordeal of cheese and bread may be a footnote in medieval history, but in the hands of modern scholars, it becomes something larger. It is a lens through which we examine the human condition, our longing for certainty, our willingness to invoke the divine, our tendency to turn ritual into law. In this sense, the ordeal remains alive, not in practice, but in the ongoing quest to understand how humans have sought truth in the face of doubt. By the time the ordeal of cheese and bread faded into the margins of law, it had already achieved immortality in the imagination of Europe. Though no longer practiced, it lingered in chronicles, sermons, proverbs, and later in literature and folklore. Across centuries, it transformed from a juridical reality into a symbol, a reminder of how faith, fear, and ritual once stood at the center of justice. Today, to speak of someone choking on their own lies carries echoes of this medieval ordeal, proof that the metaphors of the past still season the language of the present. The ordeal's symbolic power lies first in its simplicity. At its core, it was a test of swallowing. Nothing elaborate, no great flames or rivers, only bread and cheese consumed in silence before an altar. Yet in that simplicity lay enormous meaning. Food, normally a source of life, became an instrument of judgment. The mouth, organ of speech and truth, was transformed into a gate where guilt or innocence would be revealed. To choke was not simply to falter physically, it was to demonstrate moral corruption. To swallow smoothly was to prove harmony with divine will. For this reason, the ordeal endured as metaphor long after its practice ceased. Writers in the Renaissance and Enlightenment often used the ordeal as shorthand for superstition. Satirists mocked it as evidence of medieval folly, a quaint but foolish practice that symbolized the darkness before reason. Voltaire, though he never described the ordeal specifically, often lumped it with other examples of ecclesiastical absurdity. To Enlightenment minds, the ordeal demonstrated how religion had warped law, subordinating evidence to ritual. Yet in their dismissal, they inadvertently preserved its memory. By ridiculing the ordeal, they kept it alive in discourse, a symbol of what they believed modernity had transcended. The Romantics, on the other hand, sometimes looked back on ordeals with fascination rather than mockery. To them, the ordeal represented an age when mystery and faith animated human life. They saw in such rituals a poetry that rational courts could never reproduce. In their imagination, the ordeal of cheese and bread became part of the tapestry of medieval life. Archaic, yes, but also strangely beautiful in its sincerity. In the 19th and 20th centuries, historians began to excavate the ordeal not merely as curiosity, but as evidence of how societies operated. It was studied not as comedy, but as anthropology. They sought to understand why it existed, what social needs it served, what symbolic structures it reflected. In this phase, the ordeal moved from satire to scholarship, from ridicule to respect. Even if scholars judged it flawed, they treated it as an earnest attempt to bind community, ritual, and justice together. In modern literature and media, the ordeal reappears occasionally as metaphor. Crime novelists invoke it as a symbol of archaic justice, playwrights use it to highlight the absurdities of belief, and educators stage it to illustrate how far society has traveled. In these representations, the ordeal of cheese and bread becomes more than historical fact. It becomes a mirror, reflecting back our unease with the relationship between truth and ritual. Its legacy also persists in how we conceive of law. The ordeal reminds us that justice is never only about evidence. It is always also about performance. In the Middle Ages, that performance involved priests, altars, bread, and cheese. Today, it involves lawyers, robes, oaths, and juries. The symbols have changed, but the logic remains. Law depends on ritual to command legitimacy. By remembering the ordeal, we recognize how much of justice still relies on belief and ceremony. There is also a moral legacy. The ordeal speaks to humanity's deep anxiety about truth. When evidence is lacking, when words contradict, when guilt is uncertain, we are haunted by the question, how do we know? Medieval people answered with God's intervention, invoked through ritual. Modern people answer with science, evidence, and technology. But the anxiety is the same. The ordeal of cheese and bread becomes, in this sense, a timeless parable of the human struggle to pin down truth in a world of shadows. The ordeal's endurance as symbol also lies in its absurdity. To modern eyes, the idea of deciding guilt by choking on food is grotesque, even comic. Yet that absurdity shocks us into reflection. It forces us to confront the fragility of human judgment. If medieval people could mistake choking for guilt, might we not also rely on equally fragile signs today? Body language in court, tone of voice in interrogation, the flicker of a polygraph needle? The ordeal warns us that no system of truth-finding is beyond bias, fear, or error. Furthermore, the ordeal compels reflection on the intertwining of sacred and secular. Medieval society knew no sharp divide between the two. The altar was also a courtroom, the priest also a judge. In remembering the ordeal, we recall a world where divine and human justice were inseparable. Modernity prides itself on separating church and state, yet debates about morality, law, and faith show that the entanglement persists. The ordeal, as legacy, reminds us that the struggle to balance sacred conviction and secular law is as old as Europe itself. The endurance of the ordeal also lies in its sheer vividness. Other ordeals, walking on fire, being plunged into rivers, were dramatic, but the ordeal of cheese and bread was intimate. It happened not in rivers or flames, but in the mouth, in the act of swallowing. It made the body itself the site of judgment. That intimacy, that claustrophobic proximity of guilt and innocence, resonates across time. It reminds us that truth is not always discovered in grand gestures, but in small, private acts. Today, scholars, artists, and the curious return to the ordeal as both symbol and story. For some, it is a reminder of how far law has come. For others, it is a parable of how fragile justice still is. It invites us to humility, reminding us that our own systems, centuries from now, may look just as strange to future eyes. The ordeal of cheese and bread thus survives not as law, but as lesson. In classrooms, professors use it to provoke discussion. How would you feel? They ask students if your guilt or innocence were decided by eating bread in front of a silent crowd. The thought experiment forces empathy across centuries, collapsing the gap between us and the medieval accused. In museums, displays of trial records remind visitors that behind the ritual stood real lives, men and women whose fates were sealed by a swallow or a choke. Their stories, though largely lost, remind us that history is made not only by kings and wars, but by ordinary people caught in the grip of ritual justice. Thus, the ordeal's final legacy is human. It is not only about bread, cheese, or law, but about the men and women who knelt before altars, who trembled under the gaze of their communities, who swallowed or failed to swallow. Their voices are largely gone, their names erased, yet their presence lingers in the ritual's shadow. Through them, the ordeal becomes more than symbol, it becomes testimony. The medieval ordeal of cheese and bread may appear today as superstition, but its echoes remain. In our language, in our rituals of law, in our anxiety about truth, it continues to haunt. It is a story of fear and faith, of justice sought and justice denied, of communities clinging to ritual when certainty was beyond reach. As long as humans struggle with doubt, the ordeal will remain. Not as practice, but as parable, a reminder that truth is never easy to swallow. History is often remembered in its grandest forms: battles, monarchs, revolutions, empires rising and falling. Yet sometimes, the most revealing truths about humanity lie in the smallest acts. The medieval ordeal of cheese and bread is one such act. On the surface, it was almost absurdly simple. A person accused of crime kneeling before an altar, swallowing a small portion of bread and cheese, under the watch of priest, community, and God. If the food went down smoothly, they were declared innocent. If they choked, guilt was proclaimed. Such a scene may strike the modern mind as laughable or cruel, a ritual of superstition unworthy of serious memory. Yet when examined closely, it becomes a mirror of humanity's deepest struggles, our desire for certainty, our dependence on ritual, and our vulnerability to fear. The ordeal embodies a paradox that transcends centuries. It reveals the human hunger for truth in a world clouded by doubt. Medieval courts lacked forensic science, fingerprinting, or cameras. Communities lived in tight circles, bound by trust but also suspicion. When a theft occurred or an accusation arose, evidence was often absent. Words conflicted, witnesses contradicted one another, motives blurred. In that vacuum of certainty, people turned to the divine. Bread and cheese, ordinary elements of sustenance, were transformed into vessels of judgment. It was not the food itself that decided guilt, but the belief that God would act through it. Seen this way, the ordeal is not so alien to us. Today, we pride ourselves on rational courts, forensic science, and DNA testing. We see ourselves as liberated from superstition. And yet, the echoes remain. Modern trials still rely on rituals, solemn oaths, judges' robes, jury deliberations in closed rooms. These acts are not strictly necessary to prove guilt or innocence, but they create an atmosphere of legitimacy. They remind participants that law is more than evidence. It is also a ceremony. Just as the medieval ordeal required faith in divine judgment, modern justice requires faith in the system itself. If that faith falters, trust in verdicts collapses. The ordeal of cheese and bread also forces us to confront the fragility of truth-finding. To entrust a person's fate to a swallow or choke strikes us as cruelly arbitrary, yet we, too, use imperfect measures. Polygraph tests, though widely doubted, are sometimes trusted as indicators of truth. Juries may interpret body language as evidence of honesty or deceit. Entire cases may hinge on circumstantial evidence or the persuasiveness of rhetoric rather than indisputable proof. The ordeal reminds us that, however advanced our systems, human judgment remains vulnerable to error, prejudice, and performance. Perhaps most poignantly, the ordeal illustrates how justice is not merely a matter of law but of community. When the accused knelt before the altar, it was not a private act. The village gathered, watching, holding its breath. The act of swallowing became a public drama, binding the community together in belief that justice, however uncertain, had been served. Today, trials are less intimate, but they, too, are communal performances, broadcast in newspapers, on television, now across digital platforms. Verdicts are not only legal decisions, but social ones, shaping public trust or outrage. The ordeal of cheese and bread reminds us that justice is always also theater, and that theater shapes collective faith in truth. What, then, is the legacy of this strange ritual? It is, above all, a lesson in humility. To mock the ordeal as mere superstition is to overlook the conditions that gave birth to it. A world without reliable evidence, a people desperate for fairness, a society where the sacred and the secular could not be separated. Their answer was flawed, but it was sincere. And in their sincerity, we find reflection. Centuries from now, our descendants may look back on our own practices with the same mixture of amusement and horror. They may ask how we could trust the biases of juries, the limits of forensic science, or the spectacle of courtroom theatrics. What seems rational to us may one day appear as strange as swallowing bread and cheese before an altar. The ordeal of cheese and bread has passed into history, yet its meaning endures. It reminds us that truth has always been elusive, that justice has always required faith, and that communities have always turned to ritual to ease their doubts. It is a testament to humanity's restless pursuit of certainty in a world that rarely grants it. And so, in the simple act of swallowing bread and cheese, we glimpse the vast, unending story of human justice, a story of fear, faith, and the eternal quest to know what cannot easily be known.